Hello, strangers. But it's funny, because you look kind of familiar. Going back to one of the first stories that I ever collected, this is story number 5.
When my mom was in her 20s, she had taken up residence in the suburb of Deerfield in a one-room house. This being the 70s and an old blue-collar logging town that still had a paper mill and the matching suffocating smell of said mill, rent was $65. Mom worked full-time and drove around town in a succession of little German cars. When this story took place, she was on a Volkswagen Rabbit. Said little car was due for an oil change. The deal with foreign cars, especially in small towns, is that there may only be one such shop that specifically services them. Trying to be economical, my mom called around town to see if one of the non-exclusively foreign car shops could do an oil change. One of her calls proved successful. She drove over on a Tuesday morning, one of her days off. Now, my mom was the kind of approachable pretty you'd see in the 70s. She had free-flowing, wavy brown hair, long legs, and a tiny, nipped waist. I've seen a lot of pictures of her, and on a day off she was likely to be wearing some short shorts to maximize that effect. By approachable pretty, I mean she was objectively good-looking, but in a rounded edge way that didn't immediately broadcast out of your league to the men she'd meet. But it was more than her looks. She was easygoing, and her bright smile drew a lot of guys to try their luck. She'd usually turn it into a joke that they could laugh at with her, disarming them from further attempts at courtship without them realizing they'd been rejected, thus sparing her the potential for anger, hostility, or harm. Her job was still at the police department at that time, and unfortunately, as dispatcher, she'd had a front row seat to the type of anger that a man rejected could enact. When my mom rolled up to the auto shop, nothing was off-putting. She simply filled in a new customer form, handed it and her keys to the portly man behind the counter, and took a seat on the Naugahyde chair to wait for her car to be good to go. No one approached her as she paged through a Woman's Weekly magazine months past the issue date, but at one point, smack in the middle of a story about Farrah Fawcett's favorite fall festivities, she had the sudden, creeping sensation that she was being watched. She glanced up. No one was in the lobby. The rotund gent she'd handed her keys to had promptly disappeared into the back, abandoning his post at the counter. Her eyes slid over to the glass wall separating the waiting area from the actual garage. Her Rabbit was pulled into the service bay closest to the lobby, and its hood was popped. Nothing alarming there. On the other side of the car, leaned into the engine and thus facing her, was a mechanic. When her eyes glanced over him, he was heads down, fiddling with an oil filter. He was the only person in sight, so she wondered if it was this guy who'd tripped the "someone's looking at you" alarm in her brain inadvertently. Like maybe he'd just been gazing in thought, and his eyes happened to rest on her by chance. Well, that was no cause for alarm. She put the matter from her head and returned to her magazine. About 20 minutes later, the man emerged from wherever he'd been in the back, exchanging money for her keys and the yellow carbon copy of her car's tune-up bill of health, speckled with the usual oily thumbprints and pressure transfers carbon copies always had. She thanked the man. As she turned to leave, she looked again out at the glass wall. The lanky mechanic that had been bent over her car was nowhere to be seen. So she put the receipt in her pocketbook and carried on with the rest of her week with no incident. That was until Sunday night. The telephone in her tiny yellow kitchen rang out around 9 p.m. That was a little too late for it to be anything good. My mom picked up the receiver, already a bit on edge, and asked, "Hello?"
"Bitch."
Click. My mother was stunned. It had been a woman's voice on the line, low and full of anger. Slowly, she lowered the receiver back to the phone's cradle, then looked at it for a minute. No other calls came in that night, but the next morning she heard the phone ring out again. She picked up, but instead of saying anything, she just waited. There was a shaky exhale, then the same low lady's voice again, insistently asking,
"Hello?"
My mom spoke. "Yes, hello."
"I just want to know one thing. How do you live with yourself?"
Click. The voice was gone again. This left my mom with no clue as to who this person was, or what supposed crimes my mother was apparently to have committed against this woman. She hadn't been dating anyone for months. She had no outstanding student loans nor bills that could have gone to collections. The anti-police sentiment, maybe, but again, she worked in the sticks, and the anger towards the profession wasn't then what it can be now. She'd put the phone back in the cradle, but had left her hand resting upon it, and felt it buzz up her arm as it rang again against her palm. She took a breath, then picked it up again. This time, the woman had no time for her usual pleasantries. She asked my mom if she'd known he was married. My mother was stunned and asked, Who was married? The name the woman gave, Ken, rang exactly 0 bells. My mother repeated, "Sorry, but who? And who is this? I don't know a Ken." Another exhale and a huff. The woman admitted that maybe my mother didn't know this Ken person was married, and maybe didn't know his name. Maybe she was in fact the kind of woman to just give her phone number out to strangers. My mom sank into a chair. Without thinking about it, her tone had switched from friendly citizen to professional police tone. She called her ma'am and assured the lady over the phone that she hadn't given out the number to anyone she didn't know. As was de rigueur of the day, police phone numbers weren't even listed. That's one of those things that mattered in the days of yellow-paged phone books. The woman on the other end of the line said nothing. My mom decided that meant it was my mom's turn to ask a question. Specifically, where had the woman gotten my mom's number? There was a pause, and then she admitted that my mother's number had been written on a matchbook from her husband, Ken's, work. Matchbooks and unlisted numbers. Truly a different time. My mother asked what the man's work was, but the lady began to audibly spin back up. She sounded mad, and as my mom tells it, the kind of mad that told her the woman was likely piecing together that she was mad at the wrong person. But damn it, that anger just had to go somewhere, and my mom was conveniently available for her vitriol. She told my mother to not play coy, and that she had the matchbook right from her husband's pocket. My mom asked whose pocket, and she near yelled back, her husband's. My mom, too, was piecing it together and kept it calm, again reminding the woman that she didn't know her husband. She didn't know any man named Ken, and she couldn't possibly, but then she paused. There was a time recently when she'd written down her phone number, wasn't there? She asked the woman if her husband, the eponymous Ken, worked at the auto shop over on Pearson. Triumph, too soon, flooded the woman's tone with a smug lilt. She dug into my mom, that now she did admit to knowing him, and how she just thought, but my mother cut her off. She was feeling her own anger rise. She repeated coldly, "I didn't give any man my number, but I did put it on a form at that auto shop a week ago. If anyone had her number, they had taken it off the form. My mother hadn't given it explicitly to anybody." There was a pause, and then a muttered word that sent a shiver through my mom. Over the line, distracted, already hanging up, she heard the lady say,
Again?
and then a click and a dial tone. My mom dropped the receiver back into the cradle. It didn't ring again. Likely as such, there wasn't much to say anyway. My mother didn't report it. At the time, she figured if he was a sneak enough to steal random girl phone numbers off their receipts, chances were he'd be sneaky enough to lie about it if she did call the shop, tell his bosses. She simply resolutely decided that, even with the extra charge and the extra inconvenience, she would never again return to that shop on Pearson. But it didn't stop there. For what else had my mother written on that form? Her full name, her phone number, and her home address. It wasn't even a week later when she started hearing the car outside. For a man whose profession was being a mechanic, you'd think he would have kept his own fan belts in line. But no, the car had this piercing shriek to it as it idled. She heard it one night in bed, loud enough to wake her. She laid there, waiting for the engine to turn off or for the guy to pick up or drop off whoever he was picking up or dropping off, and leave. She'd never heard that engine in the neighborhood before, but it could have been a visiting relative or a guest or a friend. But it didn't just drop off. It kept going, on and on. Whoever it was, they were parked out there in front of her house, engine running, for a full few minutes. She didn't get up, not the first night, staying in bed and waiting it out. And eventually the car left. It could have been a coincidence. She kept telling herself it was. But that all changed when she opened the front door to leave the next morning, because at her feet there was something on the welcome mat, something very unwelcome indeed. A matchbook from the auto shop. She bent down, picked it up, and flipped it open, and of course, there, scrawled in a hand she didn't recognize, her phone number. The next night, the car came back. By the time she did get up, he'd pulled off and left. But by the third night in a row, she purposefully waited on the couch in her living room. She had all the lights off inside, so when she peeked through the curtains, she didn't think he could see her, but she could definitely see him. She saw the car, idling, driverless. And off to the right, approaching the windows, she saw the dark shape of a man. A lanky man in coverall uniform, the kind of thing a mechanic wears. Her heart thudding in her throat, so hard that she felt like she couldn't swallow, couldn't breathe. She watched him approach, linger, then seemed to move closer. She saw him approach the front door, cautiously, and then reach out and try the knob. Not as cautious as to tell her it was the first time. Likely as such, she'd been trying it every night, just waiting for the opportunity, for the one forgetful moment she'd have, and the door would pop open, welcoming him inside. But of course, the door was locked, and after giving it an exploratory jiggle, he merely shoved his hands back into his pockets, turned around, and walked back to his car. The way he walked, my mom said, was like he didn't have a care in the world, and likely he didn't. He felt immune, bulletproof, and my mother began to wonder just how many women's numbers had disappeared into the matchbooks that his wife would find in the laundry. Well, he wasn't the only one with a trick or two. Finally, my mother decided to call in her trump card, her place of employment. She told some of the guys at work. She wasn't sure if they'd be on her side, but she figured, hell, nothing ventured, nothing gained. If they'd said it was no big deal, told her to stop overreacting, at least she'd have tried. But they surprised her. She had achieved the little sister role from a few of the guys, and they were pissed. The very night that she told them, one of them, an officer named Rob LaChance, decided it was a good night to patrol around the Deerfield suburb. She was still watching from the darkened windows and saw his cruiser meander by a half-dozen times before outright parking down the street, just out of view. And wouldn't you know it, Ken showed up. It had crossed my mom's mind that he wouldn't. Her luck, his last hurrah would have been the night before she had enlisted help. But she guessed he just couldn't help himself. Ken rolled up, parked in the middle of their dozy little street, the cat yowl of his damn fan belt just hanging in the air, an insistent screech. Officer LaChance let him settle in, feel nice and comfy, before creeping up behind his car, almost close enough for his front bumper to kiss the back of Ken's. Ken had just exited the car, had begun meandering up the walk to my mother's front door again, and LaChance hit the lights and siren. My mom saw Ken jump, whirl around. Officer LaChance waited a bit to see if the guy would make a run for it, but he didn't budge. He just stood there, stock still like a deer in the headlights, and was waiting for LaChance when he strolled up to the man to talk with him in my mother's front yard. Ken wasn't armed, not with anything a mechanic wouldn't have an excuse to have. Ratchets, tire irons maybe. But getting confrontational wasn't the move anyway. Ken's worst weapon that he'd had to use against my mom was the fear of him. My mom watched them talk for a bit, before seeing LaChance straighten up, motion for him to move along, and Ken left. My mom never heard that awful fan belt or saw him again. When she went back to work for her next shift at the police department, all the men were puff-chested. They'd included her burrow in the nightly patrols, and every one of them was so proud for protecting her, having such a clear-cut right and wrong situation to be in the right on. My mom asked LaChance what he'd said, what he'd hammered home to Ken to make him scurry off and never return. But LaChance would never tell her, not even when he agreed to be my godfather. Some things just shouldn't be repeated, especially in the presence of a lady. That's all he would ever tell her, and when I was old enough to ask, all he'd ever tell me. And maybe that is the right answer. After all, it's not like my mom wanted any of it to happen in the first place. Rob LaChance was a frequent guest at the house, even now, and knowing this story about him always made me feel just a little bit safer.
And that's story number 5. It's a story my mom told me only when I was older, and unfortunately when I'd happened to move out and live by myself. And surely I do have a couple of stories that'll feature on this channel soon about my misadventures there. It's so odd. Nowadays everybody has social media, and getting a couple of random friend requests is no big deal at all. There's something so much more personal about somebody taking it off of like a work form. Your phone number, your address, not just a means to see your hobbies or your gym fitness pics, the things that you have chosen to put out there into the world to whatever measure you have. It's just very discomforting to think of somebody being able to drive up to your house, where you live, where you sleep, and wait. If you'd like to reach out, email and socials are in the description. Interacting with the like, comment, and subscribe features does something, allegedly. And otherwise, we'll meet again next Tuesday. Stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.